Happy Tuesday, everybody. Uh, a couple housekeeping notes. If you want to make sure that you are in the loop on all of our programming around navigating the industrial transformation, please use that QR code. We'll also, in our last 20 minutes, be sorting questions from everybody. So if you have a question, please toss it in the Q&A function, and we'll get to it. We might get to it in the last 20 minutes. But I am really excited about today. We have an incredible panel coming up. Behind the scenes, we just had a prep session, and all of our panelists, their words, not mine, told me that they were bringing an 18 out of 10 on the energy level on this Tuesday. So I'm really excited for this conversation. A minute on background. My name is Michael Roth. I'm co-CEO of NXST. I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues on the panel and my co-CEOs, Sharice Conan Johnson and Sam Berg. For those who don't know NXST, for more than 20 years, corporations, governments, and philanthropies have hired NXST to strengthen the small businesses they rely on. We provide end-to-end solutions powered by our proprietary technology and networks for our clients to propel small businesses in their supply chains and communities. And we have a firm belief that with the right support, America's small business owners, from solo entrepreneurs to advanced suppliers, will be the engines driving new economic growth across the country. So why are we here today? Macroeconomic developments are making the role of small business more important than ever, especially in our supply chains. Over the last several years, the resurgence of industrial policy and a growing reshoring movement across administrations has been transforming supply chains in infrastructure, in energy, and manufacturing sectors. These developments have a profound impact on America's small businesses and on the workforce that supply them. But as we stand here today, the nation's small business sectors and our workforce doesn't have the capacity needed for the industrial transformation. We see it everywhere on the ground, that we just don't have the capacity needed to meet the moment. And so to meet the moment, we believe we need a movement akin to a domestic Marshall Plan to mobilize resources around the small business sector and their workforce for the industrial demands of today. So that's why we kicked off in December the New Economy Industrial Supply Chain Forum. And the forum aims to bring together government, nonprofit, private industry, and community organizations to discuss approaches to build America's small business sector in industrial supply chains. And so let's see how we are doing just in that, and seeing who's actually on the line. Let's post a quick poll, everybody. I think Katie's going to put the poll in. What sector are you representing? Okay. We've got at least a few across the board, about half in the social sector and community development, 13% in government, almost 40% in the private sector, and thank you for the foundation person for joining. So we've got at least somebody across the board. And just so everybody knows, we'll be circulating this conversation across our distribution list, so the conversation will live on. So I just want to frame today's conversation a little bit in what's happening across the country in terms of macro environment. We have been operating in a little bit of a everything everywhere all at once mindset for for the last 5 years or so. And it's continuing in 2025. There are big trends that are affecting the industrial transformation. There's the Made in America and the SBA agenda that's expanding access to capital and creating infrastructure to support a resurgence in manufacturing jobs. There's tariffs and trade policy that are on and off from this administration that are trying to address trade imbalances and protect domestic industries. We have DOGE, which is up and running, trying to drive efficiency efforts that are impacting ongoing federal investments and programs. We have state and local governments across the country that are trying to drive economic growth within this environment. We have energy policy and diversification that is trying to expedite as much energy production as we possibly can. And we have DEI and race neutral policies that have efforts underway to eliminate these DEI initiatives, shifting focus to merit-based opportunities. So I just want to get a second poll across these recent policy shifts and trends. What are the things that are most on your mind that are currently shaping your industrial supply chain work? Hmm. Okay, so a nice mix. I think this is like a great case study of everything everywhere all at once, where all of these things are impacting us. The highest percent here are state and local government actions, but across the board, these macro trends that have just been put in place in the last couple months are shaping the way that we are executing on industrial policy. And so that's a perfect frame up for introducing our panelists today. We have four incredible panelists. Zav Briggs, who's a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. He's also a co-founder of What Works Plus and a senior advisor to Friedman Consulting. We have Sue Helper, a professor of economics at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. She served on the White House staff in both the Obama and Biden administrations, and as a chief economist of the U.S. Department of Commerce. As she told me backstage, she's also a proud Midwesterner. Julius Krein, also a proud Midwesterner, is the chairman of the New Industrial American Alliance. He's also the founder and editor of American Affairs. And Spencer Lau, a director at a place that is near and dear to my heart, Next Street, who advises clients across civic, private, and social sectors with a focus on government programs and policies around business procurement and supply chain development. So without further ado, I want to kick it off with a question to the group. And Sue, I'll actually start with you. The broader goal of industrial policy is to build a strong, resilient economy that supports the middle class and strengthens national security. First, do you agree that that is the objective of what is happening in the industrial transformation today? And then from your perspective, whether it's policy, business, workforce development, we all feel like it's not actually hitting the ground. So what do you think have to be the key priorities for the public sector, for the private sector, for the social sector that we have on this call to actually try to reach those objectives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I feel like, there is actually some common ground here between Republicans and Democrats. I think that the reindustrialization, the resilience, and national security. And I also feel like some of the things that, that we've cared about in the past that are important goals for this. So we think about inclusion as necessary for finding new workers. We think about some actions that will promote new energy, also can help with climate change. Like, often it's the cheapest form of energy is actually renewable energy and the fastest to build in some cases. I guess what I feel like is needed is kind of connective tissue. We need to increase supply and demand at the same time. You mentioned a lot about the potential for small business to participate in supply chains. And I think one of the things that's very hard for them is, they get kind of one bet. All right, in there's all this transformation and they can go in one direction. If they pick the wrong one, they don't have like, more arrows in their quiver. And so really good information about, what is the pace of investment in what industry, some backstops. So yeah, I think the supply side uh emphasis is very important, cheaper capital, um, helping people build things, etc. But the demand side, and government can play a role here in providing information about what's available, in actually doing procurement. But I think that's one of the things that's surprisingly hard if you're trying to, build up a new industry, is geothermal or electric vehicles or vehicles at all. You got to gradually increase the supply and gradually increase the demand kind of in lockstep, because if you don't do that, somebody's going to be left, holding a bag.
Thanks, Sue. Julius, same question to you. Do you agree on the objectives of industrial policy, and what needs to happen to actually make it happen?
Well, I think obviously a lot of Republicans would probably be not too excited about climate change and decarbonization. But on the whole, insofar if these things are in fact lowering costs and issues like that, then I think you would get broad support, and you see that on some areas like nuclear, geothermal, and others. I mean, this may be a little bit academic. In my view, industrial policy kind of always comes down to national security and economic sovereignty more broadly, and it's really about kind of productivity and competitiveness and moving your country's industry sort of up the value chain. Certainly, other countries in the past and at the present have engaged in very successful industrial policies that involve wage suppression, that don't necessarily target a rising middle class as a goal. So, that can be a goal of industrial policy. I think if you execute industrial policy very well and improve productivity, standards of living will go up and so on. But I think you actually do need to be very clear about whether you're targeting productivity or whether you're running a jobs program. There are reasons to run jobs programs, but fundamentally you have to make industries that are globally competitive, and are taking market share. But again, I think a lot of that is sort of academic for now.
Thanks, Julius. Zav, same question to you.
Michael, thanks for the question and for including me today and bringing us all together. I agree with Julius. I think that the big drivers of industrial policy, industrial strategy, are as he outlined them, national security and economic competitiveness being the single most important. And the kind of proof point for that is that what we're seeing now, we haven't seen since the days of the Cold War and the space race, which is telling, or the Sputnik moment, to go even further back. But it's a sense of being in a foot race, of really needing to move all out, so use all your muscles, public and private, and to involve a variety of different regions across the country. If you think about what happened during the Great Recession, a partial exception to this might be the automaker restructuring. We stood to lose a ton of jobs and a ton of suppliers, especially in a big industrial shed in the middle of the country, and the federal government did not let that happen. But that was, in response to what was seen as sort of a temporary shock, a deep one, but a temporary shock, driven by just a collapse in demand, given what was going on in the economy as a whole. Not the deeper need for restructuring, for modernizing the entire industry or onshoring a set of things that we've been content to to buy from overseas for a very long time. So I do think it's important to be clear on this, but also to do, as Julius and in particular Sue were saying, to tell and retell the story of the variety of benefits, because there really is a ton of common ground across party lines, but also across different parts of the country when it comes to what this can help the country achieve if we get it right. And short version, since you asked, what needs to happen, we haven't done a lot of sector strategy in this country, really. So we tend to come at it, at least initially, in a pretty fragmented, pretty siloed way, not as much coordination as we could use. And we're in a bunch of areas, whether it's workforce, supplier development, or call it small business development, we're still not yet outcome oriented enough. We have systems kind of premised on how much volume are you doing? How many people are coming through? Did someone complete a business planning program or something like that? Not did we create relationships and capability and demonstrably move the needle to improve economic outcomes. And we could be betting in those ways. There's some signs of it. I'm sure we'll get into it in the conversation. There are really positive outliers around the country. But we're still not there enough. And you see it in conversations with big companies and small, and with civic actors too, thinking about things like long-run housing affordability. As my region gains income, how do I make this an affordable place to live, for working families and not price them out of our community? So it's healthy that these things are getting attention.
So, and Spencer?
Yeah, well, first off, just thank you, Michael, for organizing and hosting this, and then, of course, to all the panelists as well. It's exciting to be part of this discussion. I very much agree with everything that has been spoken thus far, insofar as there is a real intention around industrial policy to engage around national security and economic competitiveness. And I think that the piece that is the underlying thread as well that Zab was just speaking to as well is the context around the identity that's tied to reindustrialization. As most people are thinking about the elements of a manufacturing community, that they really want to have it be a core fixture within how people are actually presenting the US. And so, that's also something just to consider as well, to be able to tell that story and to be able to be proud of a industrial base that ultimately is the crux of what has been, in large part, the US development overall. And in thinking in terms of solutions, Michael, you said at the start of it really about capacity. And I think the single most important thing at this moment in time is that realization that our capacity to produce at this moment needs to be reproduced and rebuilt. It just can't be assumed. The conditions around industrial policy are in place around subsidies, public investments, trade policies, et cetera. But now it's really the hard work of how do you build an industrial base and how do you build that base of small and mid-sized businesses and workers to all have that cross-sector focus around really that sector focus that Zab was speaking to. And what we've seen across the country is really that intention around trying to build those industrial ecosystems, which are the orientation around business acceleration or manufacturing extension, capital and financing, the workforce development, and the core intention around technology and R&D all working in one tandem. And that part of it is now a real question of how do we translate a lot of what we're seeing from sort of a top-down approach around industrial policy to really then realize something that then leads to the core objectives that we have around industrial policy from here.
Thanks, Spencer. So I hear a lot of alignment around the core objectives of what we're trying to accomplish. One thing I want to pull out, Zab, you said we haven't seen a mobilization effort like this since the space race or since World War II, and I think that's it's a beautiful way to understand the magnitude of what we're trying to accomplish here. And yet, when I go around to the industrial base across the country, when I talk to business owners in manufacturing, when I talk to their workers, they don't see themselves as part of it. They often feel left behind, which is very different from those times, very different from the space race where I wasn't, I might fool you with my age, but I wasn't around then. But there was a sentiment that we were all in this together. And when I go around and I talk to people, I feel quite the opposite. I feel there's the feeling of being left behind. And so I want to understand from you all, what's the actual impact of these policies on small businesses and their workers? What are the opportunities for them? What are their challenges? How do we overcome things like perception and change management as we try to drastically change our economy? And I might go in reverse order and start with you, Spencer.
Or, yeah, I mean, I think to your point, Michael, that presents the core challenge that we have right now, where very much that focus on taking that industrial policy investment and trade policy investments in focus areas to then see it come down into communities is one that then breaks down into how do you create that type of base of support for small, mid-sized businesses and workers to actually realize it. And when you talk to a small or mid-sized business themselves, they're not thinking about these mega trends that are affecting the globe. They're really thinking about what this means in terms of their revenue and their costs. What does it mean in terms of actually having a skilled workforce to be able to build out new capabilities and ultimately have a good living for their own workers and employees as a result. And what that needs to be translated into is really a question of how do you see these mega things all kind of get into a place where you can translate it into where are those opportunities that Sue was speaking to at the very beginning, right? Like, how do you actually make the big bet on your business to be able to move in this direction versus another? And then how do you then connect with the right capital or financing that then is required for you to make those types of big bets as a result? And so, in order for us to translate the macro idea into something that's very specific, it requires thinking about it in the context of what are the needs that a small and mid-sized business and their workers actually need at this moment to be able to navigate a transition, which is going to happen in the context of their business as a result.
Thanks. And same question for you, Zev.
Michael, I'm going to reference something that Spencer and I put together recently and published. It's available on the Brookings website if folks are curious, calling for a Marshall Plan for small businesses in our country. But crucially, this part might have been less expected. We said America needs a Marshall Plan for small businesses and their workers. Why? Well, number one, most workers in the economy work for small and mid-sized companies, not large ones. I think we all sort of know that, but we tend to forget it. The talent needs, the other needs of big businesses just get more attention and kind of garner the headlines. And as we think about any industrial strategy that's going to succeed, the talent, the skilled workers for small and mid-sized companies are enormously important to that. They're absolutely central to productivity, and that includes as newer technologies, including artificial intelligence, I should say generative artificial intelligence, also come online. But in general, in our research at Brookings in a whole host of regions that are kind of on the front lines of this new industrial strategy, many different parts of the country, we find that it often works best when companies, as Spencer said, and education and training providers and business accelerators and others are actually a part of an ecosystem that thinks itself as an ecosystem where people stay in relationship to each other. And you don't, for example, have small companies forced to kind of go hat in hand to the community college system or to these other large institutions and each sort of tailor something, one company at a time, but rather collaborators in an industry or an emerging cluster or a strengthening one are working together. So there's something of an industrial commons, which sometimes this has been labeled. So institutions and relationships that support productivity broadly and are growing a local supplier base, a local talent base that are projecting demand outward so that you don't see costly skill shortages. And that likewise have people thinking about the very different timeframes on which these things can work if you're, let's say, building a plant right now versus perhaps working on a newer technology that's going to be developing over years and years and commercializing more gradually. if that makes sense.
Thanks, Seth. And Julia's question to you, and I'll just add something from your first answer. You talked about how, what you were talking about is maybe a little academic, but you called out the appropriate tension between objectives of productivity and good jobs programs. So can you help just bring it down a level for us, and talk through like what's the actual what's the actual goal and what's the actual impact and opportunity you see for small business and their workers?
Yeah. First off, I'd say there's a couple of sources of fracturing or bifurcation. First one on the trade policy side, we have a somewhat strange situation in which the sectors, companies most experienced at using our trade policy tools like tariffs tend to be kind of very, early stages of the value chain. So steel, aluminum, things like that. While if you're at a higher part of the value chain, um, actually raising the cost of those input products is hard for you. And yet, in our kind of political discussions, everything kind of gets lumped into tariffs, binary, yes or no. And I don't think there has been enough work or thought given to designing a trade policy. And I'm not, trying to dismiss or be prejudicial against the steel guys, but that also looks at the actual manufacturers further, whether it's, drones or ball bearings or whatever, and how trade policy actually adjusts to that. Now, on your second question, I think this is actually very important. We have a very different economy today than in 1950, and obviously I'm caricaturing a bit here. Obviously, I wasn't around then either, but in 1950, the largest investors, most profitable companies are also the largest employers, big integrated manufacturers, GM, GE, etc. You're working there, you're probably part of a union, all of that. That is completely different from the manufacturing landscape we have today. There's a couple of big integrated still around, but most of it is, fractured in small business, non-unionized, and the investment landscape is very different. You've got a plethora of middle market PE funds, VCs, and I think, we have to do a much better job at the supply chain mapping and the investment connection. I know Professor Helper did some of this when she was in government, but there's so much work to do, and connecting the supply chains of a GE or an Apple or what these big companies with Lockheed Martin, whatever it is, with their smaller suppliers, and then pointing the investment dollars at where the gaps are. A lot of work needs to be done there, and it really needs to be led by the policy side. I would say, I suspect this isn't translating at the worker end. You are starting to see it at the investor. VC's very excited about hard tech now. My organization, the New American Industrial Alliance, there's real estate investors, Wall Street. People are actually very excited about this. A lot of this stuff is becoming, dare I say, fashionable, and attractive. But where that's not going to translate down to the worker yet, because for the most part, not a lot of we're still laying the ground. Not a lot of this stuff has actually been built, connecting these smaller companies to the larger supply chain. That still needs to happen. And then, of course, you have a larger policy framework of how this is all going to fit that remains sort of uncharted waters because we haven't done it before. We haven't done it in a long time. So I would say we are starting to see that kind of big collaboration. And the other part, there's cultural divides here too. There's big divides between what I'll call Silicon Valley manufacturing and say like Ohio manufacturing. A lot of these guys, the small businesses have been survivors of 50 years of deindustrialization. They don't trust, they don't want to talk to private equity. They don't want to talk to VC. They don't like the government either. And yet these are kind of the only players that can probably show up and bring big amounts of capital to inject, new technology, new facilities. And those motivations are not totally aligned. So that's another area that will need to be resolved.
Thanks, Julius. So Sue, I think he teed you up on on the supply chain mapping, and how you actually bring this down to businesses and workers. And I'm also curious on Julius's last point. Is it okay if right now we're feeling the movement is upwards in the, let's say, in the ecosystem, where there's investment dollars starting to move, but the actual businesses and their workforce are quite resistant? What do we do about the tension point that is existing for businesses and their workers?
Yeah, wow, what a great rich thing to tee up. I think one thing, I mean, both Julius and the Marshall Plan reference AM Forward as a kind of way forward, which is when I was one of the architects of that, so I'm proud of it. It's small, but basically it is doing exactly what you all are calling for, of connecting these small businesses to their larger customers. In this case, it was GE Aerospace, Siemens, Boeing, Lockheed. So 7 OEMs that agreed to make commitments to help their small suppliers adopt additive manufacturing. So commitments around workforce, around financing, around demand. And around standardization that make this sort of more of a reality. So that's, one group of OEMs, one technology, but I feel like it's really important. And I think it also solves, I think there doesn't have to be a tension between productivity and jobs. And in fact, to some extent, it goes the other way, that, manufacturers scream that they can't find workers anymore. And part of that is that the manufacturing wage premium has disappeared. Manufacturing jobs are more stressful. They often are done in, worse climate conditions than working at a Burger King or something. And so if you want to attract people, it's sort of supply and demand. You got to pay a higher wage. But with their current business model, a lot of companies, these small companies, really can't afford that. I mean, honestly, can't afford. They're not making profit and so they need, the smart manufacturing, the AI, the additive to really compete. I think both the workers and the firms, I think Julius is really right that there's a kind of distrust that you haven't seen, that either the customers or the finance people have actually been helpful. I think there are some models. We have a bunch of institutions now that are all quite small. We have in the States, we have the manufacturing extension partnerships that in some states are quite good at connecting people with small businesses with tailored advice. So I think there's a beginning of institutions, beginning of things that we can draw on. I guess I feel like it's important in designing these things to involve all the stakeholders. And so that, when you talk about in workforce, there's this idea of the sector table where you bring together all of the stakeholders that are involved in hiring and training and retaining workers, those groups need to think about designing jobs, redesigning jobs, that the new technology affords the possibility of, shop floor workers involved in problem solving, actually, applying the AI, thinking about doing some preventive maintenance. So you've got to redesign the jobs and getting those stakeholders, the small businesses, what is possible for you and the workers involved in the beginning, I think is really important. And that also can build trust. So I feel like we have this resurgence of manufacturing investment in the US. It's the highest it's ever been in real terms by far. And those are a lot of often big companies making big investments in batteries or solar panels or aerospace or something like that. They are coming to chips. They will come to need smaller suppliers. And to the extent we can forecast that, work together, build institutions, and state and local governments are a key part of this, especially now, I think.
Thanks. So let me build off of that question. State and local government was the thing that the most people said was impacting what they're doing. One thing I've heard across the board from you all is, hey, this is a really big thing, but we've never done this before. Does anybody have an example or a green shoot locally, that they think state and local is working with the private sector, bringing together the ecosystem and getting to the outcomes that we all aligned on earlier on industrial policy. And I'll open it up. Just come off mute.
Michael, I'll name a few. I think Michigan, Ohio, New York, just for starters. I don't mean to shortchange Pennsylvania, Arizona, a number of other places that are doing really interesting and important things. But Michigan and Ohio and New York in particular, I think, are demonstrating what it looks like to think holistically about this, to understand these challenges and these opportunities as interconnected, and to sort of think across, perhaps not all of government, whole of government. I mean, the government does an awful lot of things. You often need to start with a few lead agencies, for example, and get going, or things get too complicated. But at least you have an effort to sort of think about, as Sue was saying, labor demand, labor supply, financing tools, funding for education and training, ways to be creative about money and get it to recycle, models like pay it forward or talent finance, and the range of things that one needs to do deep and inclusive supplier development, for example, that is not and cannot be limited to just a single government program, or to local efforts. States have so many tools. So I give those states a lot of credit. In Michigan, a lot of it is driven by the just monumental sort of restructuring of automaking. As we know, it's not a simple sort of linear transition simply to electric vehicles, but biggest changes we've seen in that industry in a century, immensely important to that state, of course. So they're taking it really seriously and creatively. In New York, some of the drivers, the game changers in terms of industrial sectors are semiconductors, given the big investment by Micron upstate. But they're kind of thinking about all these pieces at one time, talent, local supplier development, land supply, housing affordability over the long term. They don't want to become, with due respect and affection for Silicon Valley, an economically successful but highly unaffordable place that a lot of people say they need to move away from because they can't afford a decent life there. So they want to think ahead a few steps, and state government turns out to be an absolutely crucial partner. And those are a few states I think that are doing an awful lot that's right.
Thanks. Anybody want to provide one more example?
Just maybe I mean, I think Julia's raised a question of trust, I think is really important. These are people who have been the victims of untrustworthy behavior. So it's not wrong or irrational to worry. And so, the kind of classic prescription for that is the party with power, the party that wants trust, needs to take the first step and provide some kind of a gift or something. And so I think that's part of what we were trying to do with AM Forward, is to have the big companies reach out and do something first. And so there's a standardization program trying to make it easier to qualify to be a supplier to these companies. You don't have to go through separate qualification processes. They're seeking to be, or they've already gotten the approval to become an SBIC that is eligible for some low interest financing. So it's not just, I think, mapping supply chains, but building, sort of here's dots on a map, but let's build some collaborations and let's have the parties that have a little bit more breathing room, if they can take the first step and demonstrate that they are a trustworthy partner. And I think that would be customers, that would be governments, to some extent, employers.
Great. And Spencer, it seemed like you wanted to get in.
Yeah, well, I was going to add a little bit more context to some of the work that we've been doing within the state of Michigan. Zav mentioned them being one of the examples, and it's actually probably the one core reason why actually this whole panel has been at least somewhat engaged together in collaboration. We've been working with a new office there that's been in large focused on the economic transitions that have been coming from their core focus around automotive manufacturing and what that means for other types of manufacturing and other production within the US. And in it, it has really focused on three different prongs. One part of it around employers, but the other parts around workforce and connecting the dots in trying to build out that pipeline for those employment opportunities. And subsequently, if there are transition effects that happen within communities, that there is a core focus on trying to support communities when there is a potential plant closure, for example, that really could be devastating for those communities for the long run. And so those types of approaches are the types of approaches in which we really feel like are important at this moment to be able to see where there is that connectivity on translating the big trends that we said throughout this conversation into something that's actionable. I'd add one other piece that I think I've heard as a thread throughout the conversation. I think when we talk about small business and we talk about the ecosystem at large, that in large part it's about a network effect and a network problem that we're finding in mind. The number of small businesses that then are trying to then get engaged within supply chains creates a more complicated approach towards supporting them and building their capacity as a result. And the same part of it around building these ecosystems really is trying to create that coordinating body as a result. And so for a large part of the approach moving forward, the coordination and collaboration that's going to be necessary for us to connect the dots that then can feed into what a small business might need or what a worker might need is really the step in which is necessary at this point in time to be able to translate the big to the small.
Great. So I want to build off of a couple of those things. And maybe we've had a little too much alignment so far. So I might take us to a different place. Sue talked about trust earlier, and interestingly, the examples that Zav and Spencer gave are really big industrial projects, industrial transformations that happen to be taking place in majority minority communities, and where you need talent pipelines and supplier pipelines that exist. A lot of that talent and supplier pipeline are minority-owned businesses, minority workforces. And at the same time, there is a huge pushback on DEI policies, and a paralysis in some places on what can we and what can't we actually do to try to build trust. What might we get sued for? What's within the realm of possibility of not just doing things because they should be done, but doing things because we need these pipelines in order to achieve these objectives of industrial policy. And so I want to ask the question, and maybe Zav, you seem to be nodding, and so maybe you're the brave first person that I'll give this question to. What's the impact on this, and how can we think about it?
Such an important question, Michael. On one hand, I think we see companies and other stakeholders thinking about this on a couple of dimensions all at once. One is what's legally permissible, but frankly, a lot of the questions and a lot of the discussions are more about what's strategic, what makes the most sense right now that adds real value and helps to continue to make the business case for drawing on the full range of an industry or a region's talents when it comes to workers, suppliers, and so on. So it gets to strategy and also communications. How do I talk about this? So I say this to say you have an awful lot of companies, and not just big ones, who continue very clearly to believe deeply in the business case for creating opportunity for people of all backgrounds, and who often come from the communities that we're talking about. They're local to a region, sometimes multi-generational local, want to be a part of expanding opportunity, want to be a good employer and a good buyer, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention, understandably. They're not looking to be as visible, perhaps, as we're accustomed to companies being around some of these things, and sort of saying, here, or the special efforts I'm making. That's a lot of the history we know over the last generation or so. So they're concerned about a climate in which they fear being targeted. And I'm not just referring to really big companies that are drawing a lot of media attention, arguably a lot of the spotlight, like Meta or Target in consumer retail. I mean, other companies as well that don't want to be singled out, but they want to continue doing things and are continuing to do things like outreach, mentoring, local small business partnerships, supplier development, financing on a broad and inclusive basis. And crucially, I think I would ask us to keep in mind a whole lot of what's been labeled DEI doesn't necessarily get to removing concrete barriers to opportunity. So an example would be skills-based hiring or removing excess credential requirements that don't turn out to be all that predictive of job performance anyway. You've seen a lot of take up of that across the country, and not just private sector, but a lot of public sector as well, state governments and states, both red and blue and purple, if you will, or battleground. And I think that's a sign that people are interested in things that really move the needle. And that's distinct from a lot of the noise and conflict over what all this stuff is labeled, or about shifts in the courts on the jurisprudence around certain things like government contracting.
Thanks, Ev. Julius or Sue or Spencer, do you want to jump in and respond?
I mean, I think at this point, DEI has lost at the ballot box, it's lost in the boardrooms, it's lost in the courts. It's totally toxic. If you want to make sure that nothing gets done, if you want to polarize everything politically, then bring DEI into this discussion. If you want to actually get something done, then leave it out. I think it's pretty clear that people want to go back to an older, kind of more colorblind approach to this stuff. There is still, your anti-discrimination regime, but once you get into, de facto quota systems and things like that, you're going to do way more to sow distrust than anything else I can even think of. I think there's probably room for a lot of place-based development and things like that. Certainly, you can do, the more worker training, the better. But the stuff that's usually classified under DEI, I think that debate is over, and any attempts to bring it back will only backfire and make it worse. Though I would like to go back to the last question we were talking about, some of the state stuff. And, we often talk of the states as laboratories of democracy and things like that. I think they, would be even better as maybe laboratories of industrial policy, which is very much about trial and error and correcting and learning by doing and that sort of thing. And instead of just everybody competing for, the lowest tax rate for the Amazon warehouse, having different states compete with different models, different sectors, different workforce training, whatever, I think would be a very healthy thing. And, I think that could be one way to go to address these issues that wouldn't, cast us into a toxic stew of political polarization.
Toxic stew of political polarization. I think we got to some disagreement. Anybody want to quickly respond to that?
Michael, can I add? I mean, I think there's some things on which Julius and I probably disagree strongly, but I would agree if we were in high school debate here, Julius, this would be the proposed premise to see if we could line up around this. I completely agree. When a certain label has been made toxic, whatever the agenda and however accurately and inaccurately, it's time to move on and come at the problem and come at our shared interests in a new way. A huge number of things that have been done for years and years to expand opportunity, to remove barriers, be intentional about it, have nothing to do with quotas and never did. And they're not at the core either of a whole lot of the stuff that was attacked as DEI, like anti-bias trainings and that sort of thing, and using language in particular ways to signal interest in expanding opportunity. So I guess I don't want to litigate the term because I don't think, for reasons Julia said, I don't see that as all that productive. If you ask me, what are companies and their partners as we build an industrial strategy that works actually doing, is a whole lot of super constructive stuff and keeping a spotlight on how we can expand opportunity, create on-ramps as much as possible, is really popular on a broad basis. And sometimes it comes back to something Julius, I think, was pointing to and alluding to at the end there, place, as opposed to race or gender or veteran status or other sort of identities. There's a ton of support in all kinds of different states across the country for buying local, for example, and building up as much as possible a local supplier base. And that takes intent, and it takes strategy, and it's often measurable, and it's going well or not going well. And those are things that people who have a variety of different political points of view and ways of coming at this, it turns out, can actually agree on.
Yeah. So I'm gonna push us forward, given the time. I want to end on this question, rapid fire, for each of you. Based off of everything that we're talking about, what are you focused on? What's the one thing that you're focused on over the next 90 days? And for the people listening to it, what's a critical action that you hope that they take too? And let's start, Spencer, with you.
I think maybe pulling what Julius just said last is probably the core focus that I have. You know, in our work with states and regions, I really like the framing that Julius you had around those being laboratories for industrial policy at this moment. And for us to take that narrative that we were talking about before to really see it realized, we have to demonstrate results. And so as a result of it, it is trying to identify those regions that where the conditions are ripe. It's building those regional industrial ecosystems. It is trying to showcase where there are successes in the immediate term. And I think that demonstration of results is something that I think that we can all agree with is necessary at this moment, as we haven't been really focused in terms of industrial policy in the past, and it's something that's going to be required for us moving forward. So I'd say that's really a core focus for me.
Thanks, Spencer. Julius?
I'm most focused on connecting both parts of the supply chain and the kind of financing around it into a larger ecosystem. And to give a concrete example that's topical right now, there's a new ships office in the White House. There's going to be some shipbuilding executive orders. There's shipping trade actions that are on the table. But it's building a ship is not just about ships. Frankly, you could start with the real estate financing, which is huge. But then you get into high-end, advanced manufacturing techniques that you can deploy. You get into all the supply chains and supplier networks that take place both immediately around the shipyard and beyond. You get into the vessels themselves and repair. I think, we need to have our industrial policy conversations. It's fine if they start with ships, but we need to broaden this out into the whole supply chain, technological, and financial ecosystems that are necessary both as a political coalition and also substantively to get anything done.
Thanks, Julius. Zab?
Michael, if you'll let me, I'm going to cheat and name two, or at least one and a half. One is good jobs, all things good jobs. How to create them, how to sustain them, how to come at that creatively. That can come in a bunch of different forms. And we think that's a good thing based on the work that we do across many different regions of the country. So I'm staying laser focused on that. I think the elections and more sent us a very clear signal about the urgency of that communities feel across the country. And the second, essentially, is where we spent the first part of this conversation, government, including state governments, but other levels as well, playing their highest and best role. So it gets to those things like understanding what it looks like to approach this stuff a bit more holistically, connecting the dots, if you will, and being able to work effectively both in the near term, get some wins, because all players need them, including folks in office and folks that are appointed by those in office, but also, thinking longer term about the keys to really enhancing productivity and creating a sustainable, productive, competitive set of in industrial clusters in different parts of the country. So that's constant explaining and also listening out what's working in Michigan that Pennsylvania can learn from, what's Ohio just sort of cracked the code on, that can be shared more broadly. That's a big part of where my energy is going.
Thanks, Evan. And Sue, close us out on this one.
Well, I guess I want to violently agree with everybody, and I guess I sort of think there are kind of three key points. I mean, that regions should find, their engine of growth based on their past strengths, not trying to undercut other regions. There's plenty to do. To do that, you need some wonky data work. You also need, I think, a lot of stakeholder roundtables, really listening to everybody in your economy. I personally am working to do that in the auto industry. I see that, the transformation of the auto industry as a kind of, complementary engine of growth to shipbuilding is, demand for a lot of advanced technologies, whether it's AI, batteries, new materials, etc. So I think, hopefully those can, that could be one way of achieving this, our shared goals here.
Great, thank you, Sue. So I'll just close this out and summarize. There's an incredible amount of insights from all of you. So thank you. Some of the key things that I'm personally taking away is that there's huge alignment on building inclusive industrial ecosystems by aligning supply and demand, and there's a ton of work left to do on that. We have to support small business, and we have to foster trust through local stakeholder engagement and procurement-driven growth. There's the opportunity. We just have to align those things up and give it the right amount of capital to get done. We need to translate this big policy into local action. We need coordinated state and regional and industry strategies that connect all of these things: capital, workforce, and community investments, turning what is stated as federal goals into tangible local outcomes. And there's a piece of advancing worker and middle-class goals without labels, by focusing on practical place-based solutions like workforce training and supplier development that create value. I was trying to, throughout this, bring in some of the live Q&A that our audience brought in, and I was able to get to some of them, but there were a whole bunch that actually go unanswered. Because of time, and also because I think these are things that we need ongoing conversation about. So some of the things that are unanswered from the audience are about, there's a great question about the feeling of belonging, and quoting Robert Putnam's old book, Bowling Alone, about how do people feel that they're being left behind, because they are actually being left behind without community spaces. And do we need to drive this work and create community around it? There's a lot of questions around what it means in actual state and local places that haven't had big industrial policy before. We spent a lot of time talking about Michigan and Ohio. How about the Southeast? Where there is huge industrial policy for the first time? And how do we actually implement there that is quite different from how we implement in places where there actually is already a significant industrial base? And there's also questions about how we actually measure the success. We aligned on the outcomes. I think one thing that everybody aligned on here is we are trying to get to real outcomes here. How do we make sure that we're measuring the right things to show that we're being successful in industrial policy? And so we only just scratched the surface on this one. Thank you, Zav, Sue, Julius, for helping us scratch the surface in such an insightful way. I'll offer to everybody, this is the second of many. We're going to try to blow this out. Please stay informed with us, sign up for our newsletter, visit our website, follow us on LinkedIn, share the link of this webinar recording when it comes out. There is a space race level opportunity here. We've got people on both sides of the aisle who are focused on achieving quite similar outcomes, and it's time that everybody who filled out their survey at the beginning, between the private sector, the social sector, and government and foundations, it's time that we all really align around this and have that type of mobilization that we really need. So I thank you to our panelists. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And we will see you next time. Thank you.